Well, I want to welcome Greg White, who's the General Counsel and Chief of Staff for the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation in Massachusetts. We're going to talk about things that really affect all of us, and one of those things is identity theft and people being able, in one fashion or another, to interrupt our lives by stealing our identities, and how your office gets involved with that.
Sure. Well, one of our mandates is overseeing the data breach notification. If you're an entity in Massachusetts and you hold personal information of Massachusetts resident, that information's been compromised, you're required to notify our office, the Office of Consumer Affairs, as well as the Attorney General's office. We maintain a database that people can readily access. And last year alone, we had over 2,000 breaches that we are notified of.
So, excuse me, those are like businesses, retailers,
yes,
or other stores?
Yeah,
who are
which is one of the main sources of breaches. Right. You know, we were talking during the break about identity theft. And, you know, when I started my career as an attorney, I was a prosecutor for 10 years in Worcester and 14 overall. Back then, identity theft consisted or came about as a result of you or I losing our wallet.
Right.
Back in the day, your license number had your social security number, so they were off and running. Now, people don't even have to leave their homes. They can be halfway across the world and hack into your system. Someone said to me on one of the shows recently, how do you prevent yourself from being a victim of identity theft? And I said, well, go back to the Stone Ages. Don't use credit cards, don't use a computer, don't interact on social media. But that's not practical. It's not, you're not going to be able to exist in that world anymore. It's not a question of whether or not you or I are going to be a victim of identity theft. That's a given. The only issue is when it's going to happen and how often it's going to happen. Recently, this past year, I was notified by my mortgage company that my information had been compromised. That same week, I was notified that as a former member of a presidential administration working in Washington, my information had been compromised. So within 7 days, I had been compromised in terms of my prior employment as well as my mortgage. Wow. And there's steps that one can take to help reduce your exposure if in fact you've been a victim of identity theft. You know, first and foremost, you would notify your financial institution and have your card
change your card.
Changed.
Yeah, sure.
One of the most important things, though, is you can put a freeze on your credit. Folks don't know that. You can also request your credit report, and by law, you're entitled to receive a free one once a year. And look at that to see if, in fact, what is being purported on that is, in fact, attributed to you. Putting a freeze is one of the most significant ways that you can limit your exposure. Oh, okay. We were talking about home improvement. This past year, my wife and I had some work done. We were meeting with the contractor, and one of his staff learned that I was with the Office of Consumer Affairs, and she said to me, oh, you know, recently I was a victim of identity theft. And I said, oh, how did that come about? She said, well, I went to refinance on my home, and I found out that someone had used my information to purchase a condominium in my name and purchase a brand new car. And it wasn't until they ran her credit report that this was disclosed. She wouldn't have found out about it until they started defaulting on the payments. So by putting a freeze on that, that ensures that at least high-level or high-ticket items won't go through.
Is that something we all should do?
I think it's a great idea. In fact, as a result of this, I was offered a free credit freeze for a period of time, so I put it on. My wife and I went to purchase a high-ticket item, electronics, and I went in there and they said, well, listen, if you want to open a credit card, you get 10% off. And I said, no, I'd just like to pay it. They said, you can pay it. Just open it up, get the 10% off and pay it. And I said, great. Gave them my information. They came back and they said, well, we got corporate on the line. It's been declined. And I got on the line. They said, did you recently put a freeze on it?
Oh, sure.
I had forgotten about it. And they said, do you want to remove it? I said, no, we'll use my wife's information, you know. But the fact of the matter is, It does prevent someone from using your information should you be a victim of identity.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
'Cause I've heard both sides of should you put a freeze on,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I don't even know if it costs money to do that. I believe it does, right?
Well, if you've been a victim, then it's free, but you know, it's worth it. It's worth
Well,
it.
that's good advice
Yeah,
then. I think
absolutely.
that's
So,
good advice.
so we oversee the data breach, and as a result of which, you know, we're aware of what's going on out there. Also, as part of the Office of Consumer Affairs, we oversee the consumer hotline. We have 4 students from Northeastern, co-op students, who are with us. We break it up into 2 segments. One starts in January and goes through June. One starts in July and goes through December. We have a terrific group of students who have been manning the lines. They take hundreds of calls a day, and many of the calls involved identity theft and what you can do to prevent it. One of the things that, you know, they're not attorneys, they're not there to offer legal advice, but there's suggestions that are often. One of the things is changing your password and changing it often, which is a very common mistake. People attribute a password to something that can easily be identified with.
sure.
I'll tell you a very quick story. Recently, my brother, who lives in Europe, contacted me. He said, "You need to change your password. Your system's been hacked." I went online, changed it to you know, names and numbers that couldn't be associated with me. So long that recently my son and I were running a half marathon in Pennsylvania, and the gun was about to go off, and I was trying to access iTunes. So he said, "What's your password?" So by the time I gave it to him, the gun had gone off and everyone had run by us. But the fact of the matter is no one's going to be hacking into my system. So
And then the other part of that has to do with these.
skimming devices, yes. And again, as we talked about during the break, unfortunately, they're out there. We're finding them in ATM machines. We're finding them in gas pumps. We're finding them on price scanners at department stores. Our Division of Banks, which oversees state-chartered banks and credit unions, this past year we're notified that an ATM down in the South Shore had been compromised and 1,000 consumers' information had been breached. Last year we found 4 skimming devices in a small radius out in the western part of the state by our inspectors inspecting fuel pumps. There are things that you can do. You know, one of the things are these sleeves that you can purchase. You put your credit card in there and it prevents them from accessing your information. Now, that only helps with handheld skimming devices,
Right.
because as we talked about,
But as holiday season comes along,
Yep.
and you're out shopping, you're out
Absolutely.
traveling more, this is handy enough that I'm going to get myself.
absolutely. And one of the things that it does, as we talked about, it prevents someone with a handheld skimming device, which they're using in gas and airports and bus stations and train stations. They'll walk up, brush up against you and download your information. So these sleeves protect your information.
It's a crazy world we live in.
It is.
And I'm
It
glad
is.
that you're trying to do something.
Well,
Your
we're-
department's trying to do something.
We're
to help
out
us.
there, and we're trying to stay a step ahead, but as we, again, talked about during the break, you know, one of the things that we advise consumers is that when you pump your gas, look to see if there's a protective seal on it. If that's been breached, notify the proprietor. Recently, our inspectors notified us that they've come up with counterfeiting
Wow.
seals. So they'll breach the seal and then they'll place one on top of it.
Hard to do anything about that. You can't pump the gas
Yeah,
without
yeah,
using a gas.
yeah, exactly. And we don't advise consumers to take things into their own hands. Recently, there was a correction officer who was attending a concert down in Providence, and he went to take some money out of an ATM machine, and he noticed that the facade on it was ajar. So he pulled it off, and lo and behold, there was a skimming device.
And not recommended for all of us to do that.
No, because there's forensic evidence there. You notify the bank, they'll notify the local officials, will notify the FBI and Secret Service, and they'll go ahead and
To
conduct
say
an
nothing that if we did that and we were wrong,
Right,
that's not
then-
that's
then,
probably
yeah,
not.
and it's all on camera,
It's
too.
all on camera.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for letting us know a little bit about this, and
Sure.
we'll be showing the information where people
Great.
can get in touch with your office. if they have a
Absolutely.
problem.
I'll provide a toll-free number and our local number for you to put up on the screen.
Terrific.
Great.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll be back soon.